So now a bit of a counter, all right? So when I think of as well the King of Swords, I think of Gordon Parks. Here he is, this black man with his gaze in a self-portrait, gazing back. One of the greatest photographers of the 20th century. Are y'all familiar with Gordon Parks? No? Okay. No? Oh, great. Okay, great. I love to obviously be exposing y'all to new things. He was a humanitarian with this deep commitment to social justice who left like a great body of work behind, documenting culture from like the early 1940s into the 2000s, focusing on race relations, poverty, civil rights, urban life. He was born in Fort Scott, Kansas, in poverty and segregation in 1912, and was drawn to photography as a young man by images of migrant workers that were taken by the Farm Security Administration in a magazine. He bought a camera in a pawn shop and taught himself to use it. And his pictures allowed him to break the color line in professional photography. He creates images that were consistently exploring social, economic injustice, the impacts of poverty, racism, and discrimination. He says that I saw that the camera could be a weapon against poverty, against racism, against all sorts of things. I knew at that point I had to have a camera. So hopefully the sword has been explored, clearly as eyesight, as mirror, as visuality, the gaze, and so thus becomes the camera. Right? Hopefully that's clear. Okay. And it's my invitation or like my suggestion, that you make metaphors of each of the objects in the suits, of the cup, of the wand, of the pentacle, etc. In that kind of like logical linking or progression, right, as well. He had and possessed, like, maintained a sort of intimacy between the photographer and the subject. He was known for that. He would get close to his subjects, which included Malcolm X, Muhammad Ali, as we'll see a bit later, Harlem gang members, families in the Jim Crow era Deep South. He would embed with them for weeks, developing a certain access and a nuanced understanding that gave us strikingly candid, honest images as we could get. But he maintained a phototistic journalist and journalistic distance. That King of Swords, of course, has a certain objectivity, or a distance. But at the same time, he was able to surrender a fixed point of view to produce, again, as honest an image as possible to show a more candid shot. He was slipping between high and low culture, rich and poor, going in and out of spaces to gain trust. There are documentaries about him. It is out there. I'm not sure on what platform, but there should be a relatively recent documentary. He never really broke the fourth wall or became part of the story. And so Ava DuVernay, I'm sure you're all familiar with, says that at a time in a society where black people were told far too often that we're criminals, that we're ugly, that we're less worthy to have the spotlight on us for any reason, Gordon put a lens and a light on us for ourselves and allowed us to see the elegance of the lives that we live and the places where we are. He is like the precursor, in a lot of sense, to this visual activism that we have now, right? He knew that photography has this ability in the medium to provoke social change, that it is a central character. He is this like activist, DIY socio-historical documentation that's obviously now ubiquitous in the culture. He was a precursor, kind of leading his influence to, like, I'm thinking of like Knight and Page of Swords, and then also somewhat in the creation of visual evidence to the King of Pentacles. All right. So as well, Fire of Air. This is the Visconti Sforza King of Swords. And, I like this image because he's in full body armor. That also makes, again, it like is like mirror, has this mirror quality, right? His body becomes the mirror, which I think is very clear there, right? Fire of air, ideas, flashes of thoughts, an active intellect, a hot wind, scorching air. King, because all of the kings are fire, and then, like, I'll be covering that as well, like the elemental combinations of knights, air, right? So a combat leader. And if y'all have any more associations with Fire of Air, feel free to, this is obviously not an exhaustive list, feel free to share them in the chat of just thinking about them in that combination. I feel is like generative as we go, but No pressure, but just yeah, think about that. So, and with this king, it's like yes, tarot offers us an ability to read a stranger's book, to enact a prismatic perception that, unlike Willow, is not an attempt towards this total transparency of the soul. Transparent soul, as we spoke about in the Fiction of the Pose class last week. Because would that even be possible, let alone ethical, right? Like I can see your whole ass soul. The cards mean one thing in one context for one reading for one person. You shuffle them and their meaning, their image, their consideration changes. And it's not always crystal clear, but obviously you trust that the reading has a relevant gnosis nonetheless. All right? As Edward Glissant would say, very much another King of Swords, the cards reserve a right to opacity by maintaining their mystery. To push against the idea that you can entitle yourself to look and assume you know what my soul looks like, is like that's that opacity quality that we want to maintain in that smoking mirror, right? Even as we do open the veil. I kind of sometimes think of it as like a peephole rather than like a whole ass like I don't know, peep show or something, or like maybe the lens of the camera that we learn to navigate with more skill, rather than like this super voyeuristic kind of thing, something that requires trust to produce a candid, honest shot, right? Otherwise, we may just be maintaining the whole digital bullshit of participating in all that image economy, right? So I'm trying to emphasize the ethical considerations here of tarot reading, because there are those psychics, like, who try to Professor X King of Swords your shit, like in terms of like, his whole thing is like this violation of consent. Do you know what I mean? He was just like, wow, I'll try and restrain myself, but like, whenever he deemed necessary, he would just like enter your mind and like fuck with you, or you know what I mean, kind of a thing. So we don't want to do that, obviously, but know that there's also that out there. Sky, yes, a burning truth. Oh, I love that, a burning truth. Again, because mechanisms of sight are towards surveillance. Visibility in a dominating white world is dangerous. The cards tell us that the oracle is opaque and strategically so. Because when our logical mind reaches too tight of a grip, the oracle veils itself, working against that gaze of objectifying global surveillance. So that sword is a symbol of sight, of severance, of sacrifice. The divinatory obsidian blade, because obsidian is not just a mirror, it was crafted into, a variety of tools, including the blade very often. A blade very often. This makes it unique in its ability to create symbolic connections as it cuts through confusion, ignorance, deceit. Obviously, the swords is a sharp path to walk across. You may bleed a bit, but like, you bridge as well physical and spiritual worlds in the King of Swords way by endeavoring to shift cosmologies, perhaps, to shift hierarchies or representations, learning to veil yourself in plain sight, learning how to be opaque, right? To avoid a visual persecution for being transgressive or queer or whatever, right? As Native peoples were able to in a colonial landscape, worshipping their pre-Columbian deities by way of a syncretic realignment, which like Red Tarot is very much like existing in the lineage of. Forced conversion was more apparent than real. Of course, like these types of rites are clandestine because there's always been religious persecution. Fray Diego Duran would observe, keenly described colonial blindness and ignorance, saying that the Indians worship idols in our presence and we understand nothing. Right? And so it's like the tangible dimensions of practicing a decolonized divinatory life is to be seemingly invisible while in plain sight of the state and its colonized citizens. So then the swords can be a sanctuary through that space. So there is, with the King of Swords, again, this necessary mirror blade of sharpening the perception, of examining angles to create balanced portraitures of greater depth, to engage overlapping aesthetic engagements with materiality and its metaphysical conceptualizations. Natives ascribed a different value system to what the Europeans wanted gold and all this shit, and the natives were white, that's white material. Like we don't care about that as much. They saw the same thing, but they had a different engagement, and from that opened like also a different metaphysical conceptualization. So there's a reconfiguring of the aesthetic to animate the shadow mirror with a renewed agency, right? Mirrors are also mouths of light, right? Lighting is so good. Okay, okay. So a little list here that I only provide for the kings and queens, but think of where Aquarius is in your chart. The expert's expert, the professional's professional, mentors and guides, a judge, professors, authors, wise and knowledgeable about human nature, extreme rationality, strength of character, commitment with an unexpected sense of humor and very witty, often polymaths and visionaries, perhaps more head than heart, intolerance of restrictions and conventionality, extreme independence in thinking and emotions, perhaps aloof, values distance for its perspective, persuasive and passionate, fluent and compelling speaker in things respected and valued, cuts to the relevant and important instantly, values respect over likability, knowledge over feelings, lofty ideals, fierce warriors if need be, fair and impartial but mostly oblivious to individual feelings and problems. All right, so just a little list there. And then as well, I wanted to, again, for the kings and queens, offer the courts as like entries into deity work, and the kind of like elemental relationships. So hopefully a very full court consideration for y'all. So on the left from my Sacred India Tarot, which I love, is Garuda, who is this Hindu deity depicted as the mount of Vishnu. Garuda is this son of a sage, described as the king of birds, and can hold an entire world up on a single feather. He is a protector with power to travel swiftly anywhere, ever vigilant, an enemy of serpents, with eternal rights of them as food. He has this unblinking eye of like being a conquest of sleep and an infallible gaze penetrating all. And what night and repeating his name keeps snakes away at night, like thrice, Garuda, Garuda, Garuda. And then there's like this sadhana of yoga of living, like a Garuda sadhana of being able to live on air. I kind of think of that. I don't know if y'all watched Korra, the sequel to Aang, The Last Airbender, animated. No, it's a good one. I recommend it as well because it's still like they could have went there in some place. But anyway, there's this one villain and he was very King of Swords. But anyhow, it's like severance, and then he flies once he gives up like all of the attachments, kind of a thing. In the center, anyways, it's a little side if you just want to get into it. This is the Sacred India Tarot. And so on the left, yes. And then in the center, again, is our Lord of the Curved Obsidian Blade, who is a Lord of Winter, of stone, cold, frost, and judgment, right? On a volcanic stone, which is carved with glyphs of bone and of wisdom. It's almost like his whole body is just bone, right? In a sense. He's blindfolded so as to dispense justice. He wears the moon as a nose ring. He has that insightful nature of night and is also dressed like as the moon. He's white, the color of coldness and death, holding that flint knife in his hand, a symbol of sacrifice of death. But his body is actually covered with cotton, unspun cotton, if that is a symbol of disorder or order to disorder, and this like depending on the state of it. The threads of fate, that must be weaved by a spinner, by a weaver, must become a cloth to cover the nakedness to give us warmth, right? He's kind of about examining the heart, ridding it of vindictiveness, of envy, of greed, of sloth. He wears this paper cone over his penis and a paper rosette, some type of adornment there, but again, some type of like sacrificial warning is well there, but the symbol of like this point of life and fertility, rebirth, but also sacrifice and again, potential death. Let me see. I think I'll skip over some of the notes here. And then on the right, the Spirit of Clouds from the Majestic Earth Tarot. So again, just like an elemental vision, like without the human, without a human. The Majestic Earth Tarot gives us the storm sweeping across the valley, releasing this life-sustaining force that can also destroy, obviously, right? So there is an expertise and mental agility that's required to survive and thrive there. Pondering is a luxury, To anneal with air is to pursue truth, to maintain analytical precision, to temper authority with kindness, right? To be clarifying, indecisive, proficient, analytical, judicious as well. And so I do find that as well, especially with the king and queen cards, where they will really describe the atmosphere, like they're atmospheric as well.